Welcome everyone to the Miller Center's partnership with the Virginia Film Festival for the screening of Statecraft, the Bush 41 team. This is a film documentary that the Miller Center itself produced in partnership with VPM, Virginia's home of public media, which is also a sponsor of the Virginia Film Festival and a great partner of all of ours. And we're very appreciative to them for this screening. And we're thrilled today to have two stars of that film and the director and producer. Governor John Sununu was the governor of New Hampshire and served as President Bush 41's chief of staff. And prior to that was a distinguished faculty member at Tufts University, having been a faculty member there and having been trained at MIT. Philip Zelikow, a faculty member at the Miller Center and in the history department here at UVA, also served on the Bush 41 team and wrote a history of the Bush foreign policy team. And Lori Shinseki, the director and producer of this film, who's an accomplished documentarian. So we're delighted to have all three of them today for a conversation about both what the film discusses and how the film came together. I want to start with Governor Sununu, since he was there at the beginning. He helped President Bush put the team together while a great set of events were happening in the world, not just in the transition to the first Bush, to the Bush 41 administration, but across that first year. Governor Sununu, tell us what it was like, how you built the team, and also how you were navigating some of these great events that were unfolding.
Right after the 1988 election, President Bush, almost the next day or the day after, or the second day after, I don't quite remember exactly, named Jimmy Baker, Brent Scowcroft, and myself as the members of the team that he was going to start with. Jim Baker was named Secretary of State. Brent Scowcroft was named National Security Advisor, and I was named Chief of Staff. And that gave us about 2.5 months to inauguration to shape both the specifics that the president wanted included in his agenda, both foreign policy and domestic, and to start pulling people in as members of the team. A lot of the key members, of course, would be cabinet members that would have to be confirmed by the Senate, but at least the president started framing the process. But for the first couple of months during the transition, the core was really the president, the vice president, Jim Baker, myself, and Scowcroft. And we met relatively frequently, including some meetings where the president brought folks like Henry Kissinger in to talk about the state of the world. So the pre-inauguration preparation was really amongst the core members. Post-inauguration, the president started naming cabinet members. He tried to get John Tower confirmed as Secretary of Defense. That didn't work. We quickly moved virtually that same day to nominate Dick Cheney, to name Dick Cheney as his choice there. And that moved through the Senate pretty quickly. Jimmy Baker's nomination had moved extremely quickly through the Senate, I think the first or second week after inauguration. So the core of the team was really in place. Brent Scowcroft had been around a while. Jim Baker had been around a while. They knew the key members they wanted to pull in and had started pulling them in the end of December. So in terms of people on the ground, this team was pretty much in place within a month after the inauguration. And the president at that point really started making it clear that he was going to move forward on the opportunity that the US defense build up Gorbachev's awareness of the reality of the economic disparity between the United States and the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev dropping hints all over Europe that he was ready to talk, including Margaret Thatcher coming to the conclusion and notifying both Reagan and Bush that Gorbachev was someone we could do business with.
In the film, it shows, and we hear how Vice President Cheney, or at the time, Defense Secretary Cheney, talks about how the team had learning pains. You know, the failed coup in Panama was something that the team learned from as the wall unfolded. We're now just days before a new presidential election, another presidential election, and whether it's a second Trump term where there's often turnover in a team or a first Biden term. As we've watched this film, what do you reflect on about a new team coming in and learning to work with one another? What works and what doesn't work? Does it help that people know each other? Is it good that some people don't know each other and they're learning the first time around? Do you have your own reflections now, particularly having seen the film again?
Well, the most important thing is the team members have to trust each other. And I think one of the hallmarks of the Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush team, both foreign policy and domestic policy, is that we trusted each other. A lot of that trust was generated by having worked together before. Bush, Baker, Scowcroft as the most notable examples of the core. But there had been significant interaction. I had been involved in, as a governor, interacting with Vice President Bush for the 6 of the 8 years, the last 6 years of the Reagan-Bush administration. And so we developed a relationship there. The trust issue is the key thing. And to understand that when people are arguing amongst themselves for you, and that's an important point, that there was enough trust amongst the team members that they were comfortable arguing their initial positions, if you will, for the president, and then trusting that once the president made a decision, everybody would climb on board and you weren't going to get stabbed in the back with a leak that somebody may not have agreed with it. That's an extremely important ingredient in Washington, and over the recent years seems to be an aspect in the last 12 years, 15, 16 years, even beyond the 12, that has, I think, been eroded considerably. I think one of the key ingredients, the cement, if you will, that allowed the Bush team to work so closely was that we trusted each other.
That's really great. So Philip, as you look back on this period, both having been a member of team, having written about it, and then many years later coming back and not rewriting about it, but writing a new book about the period, and we've seen in the film so much is happening, not just now on the 30th anniversary of the reunification of Germany, but the things happening in the Gulf, the other changes going on around the world. When you look back on this period now, what jumps out at you?
Let me call out 2 things. The first is, and this is a real tribute to Lori Shinseki in the film and to Governor Sununu and others back then, is the film does a good job of calling out this whole point about a team. The stock historical image we have is of the giant president figure, and it all turns on kind of this one man. But actually nothing that's really large that gets done in government gets done by one person. If you actually want to accomplish anything significant in public life, it's always done by a team. And then either you assemble a good team or a bad team. In this case, you know, think of Bush as the Bill Belichick and Jim Baker as the Tom Brady. But it's a team. And so this film does a good job in just reminding people, as we're about to start a new presidency, if you want a presidency to work, you have to have a team that works. And indeed, I think one reason President Trump's presidency is a failure, really a colossal failure in my view, is because the team is a concept that's almost foreign to his administration for reasons that everyone can see and that need no elaboration. Second thing I want to call out about the film, other than the point about team, is you think going into the film, I'm going to watch a movie about the end of the Cold War. Actually, George Bush does not have a huge amount to do with causing the end of the Cold War. Mostly, this is not a movie about endings. This is a show about creations. It's about transitions and creations. It's about how out of the Cold War, you get a peaceful transition to a global commonwealth of free nations. That's the miraculous part of the story. It's not that the building collapses. It's the management of the collapse and the transition to the possibility of a better world peacefully, that act of constructive creation, that's really the hallmark of what Bush does. And people usually don't think of this period that way. They think of it as a period of endings, and instead this film reminds us to notice the creations. Because I think in the 2020s, we're going to need to go through another period of creation. So remembering that period of creation at the early 1990s could not be more timely now.
So Lori,
May I comment here, Bill?
Yeah,
on
please,
something?
John. Please, Governor.
There's a point I really do disagree with Phil on, and that is, it is easy to look back and assume inevitability. But inevitability, I think, is a serious historic mistake. I don't think the collapse of the Soviet Union was automatic. I don't think the end of the Cold War was automatic. Gorbachev was treading on thin ice through this whole process with the hardliners half a step behind him, waiting for his misstep. And one of the things that I think comes out in Statecraft and is the reality that has to be emphasized is how delicately George Bush managed both the collapse, the end of the Cold War, and set the tone for the future, the creation part, by what is really his brilliant and aggressive move of moving towards the unification of Germany as fast as he did.
I'm not sure, actually, Governor, we disagree. I said that George Bush did not cause the crisis of communism. And the systemic crisis of communism and the systemic crisis of communism plays out in different ways on two sides of the world. On one side of the world, the largest mass movement for democracy in the whole world is in China, and it is crushed. The next largest mass movement for democracy in the world is in Eastern Europe, and that part of the crisis of communism, and they have a different approach that then begins to break down, and then that possibilities of creating something better, which the Bush administration and others managed so well. But the systemic crisis of communism is something that the Bush administration inherits. And then its job is how to manage the culminating stages of that enormous crisis on two sides of the world, with some frustrations and disappointment in the Chinese side, but then hope and opportunity on the European side.
But opportunity doesn't always guarantee success. And that's the key point, I think, of the movie Statecraft.
So Lori, you fly around the country back in the days when we all could fly around the country with a film crew. You're interviewing, as well as getting to do a number of interviews at the Miller Center with some of our own experts on this. You're getting all these voices of people looking back at it, but also have the voices from the time. How do you pull this story together? Give us the narrative arc of finding the narrative arc.
Well, this could have gone in so many directions, and it was actually a challenge because so many members of the administration participated in the film, which we were so fortunate to have, but doesn't always happen. Usually you're really scrambling for people to say yes, and I think it was a testament to President Bush that so many of his team members were willing to sit down with us. So that was something that was a really, really nice surprise. To sort of riff off of what Philip was saying, the way we looked at it to tell, such a dense story that covered a very chock full 4 years of foreign policy crises was that we looked at it sort of like March Madness. a championship series, right? Where you have an incredible coach, you have a great team manager sitting right here, you have all-star players in each corner of the government, and they come together and somehow it all meshes and they're able to achieve so many incredible things and avert catastrophe, which is really hard to show in a film. You know, it's really easy to show dysfunction and drama and infighting, as you can see today in the news. But when things go smoothly, as Governor Sununu and Philip point out, you know, it all sort of goes well and people don't appreciate what was achieved. It's almost too easy. So we wanted to try to show the drama because it was incredibly tense. I mean, you know, the unification of Germany was not a guarantee. And for that to happen so quickly, we were just stunned at how many achievements took place in this very short 4-year period.
Was there a moment in making the film where you thought, okay, I've got it now. I've figured out how to weave telling about the people involved and telling about the things that are unfolding?
Yeah, I think the chronology, sort of the timeline, helped us keep everything organized because we had to tell the story of the all-star team, you know, the personalities and the people. And I honestly feel like each person, each key figure in the film, the Gang of 8, every one of these individuals deserved his own or her own film, you know, a biography. I mean, they're so storied and they're just all luminaries. So it was hard to have to weave in the events with the people who played such a huge role. So I feel like the timeline and the sort of stamping of the dates helped us organize the story that way.
So one last question to Lori and then some conversations amongst you all. Lori, you have hours and hours and hours of interviews. What got left out? What did you wish you could explain and spend more time with?
The one piece that I find really fascinating that we wanted to include about Iraq, because that's a story that spans so many different administrations, is that in his book, I think it's called Politics of Diplomacy, Secretary Baker wrote about the reasoning behind President Bush's team deciding not to go into Baghdad after they liberated Kuwait. And he listed a number of things that they were concerned would happen, you know, urban warfare and on and on and on. And that actually, his description sums up what happened 10 years later when the US went into Iraq. And many of the George W. Bush team members were interviewed. And so we spoke to them about sort of, you know, the difference between the two experiences. And I thought that was really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. So to Governor Sununu and to Philip, as you've now seen the film, and as you think about the people who have held your jobs in the intervening now 30 years, what comes across to you as models of success and models of failure? When we look ahead to whoever the president is in January 20th, next year, what should we be looking for in the people that play in these roles? Governor Sununu?
Well, I go back to a point I like to make about the 4 years of George Herbert Walker Bush. He was a great foreign policy president, but he was also a great domestic policy president. I like to point out that he passed more significant domestic legislation than any president except Lyndon Johnson and Franklin Roosevelt. So one of the things that he deserves credit for is not only did he put this team together that you talk about in Statecraft, but he had an equivalent team on the domestic policy side. And so I think that the concept of team that Lori and the film itself talks about is still the most important point. And I think that the issue of trust that I talked about is the most important point. So if I'm looking forward to trying to give a recipe to someone on what they ought to do, when they have the responsibility of the presidency of the United States is distressed, they've got to pick good people, but good people who can work together and trust together. And that agendas need to be both broad and deep. George Bush had a broad and deep agenda on foreign policy. He had a broad and deep agenda on domestic policy. And I think history, as we are part of now, history looking back, history continues to give George Herbert Walker Bush more credit as every year goes by.
Phil?
Yeah, I agree with Governor Sununu. And in fact, after Governor Sununu left the job of White House Chief of Staff, his absence was missed, with a capital M, missed. But back to your question about things to look for. Governor Sununu quite rightly stresses the teamwork. And so that on the surface, that seems to be about collegiality. Let me stress two things that go beyond collegiality and folks who get along and like each other, or at least respect each other if they don't like each other. And not everyone on this team actually liked each other all that much. There were a few little bits of tension here and there. One, integrity. This, by the way, here's where the president sets a big example. The president may not be the master of the details of all the issues, but what George Herbert Walker Bush did do is he and his top team, including Brent Scowcroft, set a tone. And it was a tone in which integrity was important. Also, professionalism, including a high degree of professionalism in the quality of the written staff work. These are unglamorous things that it's like, you do serious professional staff work, you really come to work, you don't just bloviate about your opinions. And that's combined with a level of integrity. And when that is emanated from the top, integrity, professionalism, as well as civility among the team, then the potential to be a really constructive, accomplished public executive can really materialize.
Lori, there's a moment in the film where James Baker, you're interviewing Secretary Baker, and he's talking about the collapse of some events that had happened in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he quotes George Bush saying, "I'm not an emotional guy. I don't want to play up the great failure of communism because that would be embarrassing to them." And then you play President Bush saying the same thing exactly in the exact words that Secretary Baker remembers 30 years later. Was that a choice? I mean, everything in a film is a choice, but were you trying to make an extra statement there about what it means to not be peaceful?
Bill, repeat the last word, not what it means not.
Were you trying to make a statement there about the choices made about not being boastful as a president? It seems counterintuitive because presidents seem to be always out there saying that they're accomplishing this, that, or the other thing. Were you mindful of that when you did it?
Not quite used to that, are we, anymore? I mean, I think it was his signature characteristic. He was so modest, and I don't think we really appreciated that at the time. Again, we took it for granted, and yes, it was a definite choice. I think it always works in historical documentaries when someone recalls something and then you can see it in the moment. I think in this version of Statecraft, we have footage from the Malta summit where the little boat was going up and down, and you hear people describing it and it looks scary. So I think it brings the footage to life when you can combine someone's memory with the actual event. And that was what was so cool about making this film, is that we were able to dig up a lot of that old footage. And just to follow what Philip said, I personally was so impressed looking at a lot of the documents, the historical archives that the Bush Presidential Library has, that I think the Miller Center now keeps in its files, which are the daily logs, the White House logs, of the president's schedule. I mean, the rigor of that White House from, like 5 a.m. until midnight. It was just sometimes there were like 2-minute events that would happen, just 20 pages long per day. It was an incredibly hardworking team. And so what Philip said about the professionalism, sort of clearing out the drama, make space for actual work to get done, that was really impressive. And it was sort of stunning for us to look through the day-by-day logs and see what happened in that White House.
Can I give a little historical background on the president's, frankly, his humility? His mother told him quite often, George, nobody likes anyone who brags. And the president was always fond of telling that story. And it reminded all of us that we weren't there to enhance our own resumes or our own reputation. And I think Jimmy Baker being able to quote that directly, that's a scene I think we all remember when the Berlin Wall came down, and that's where that quote came from. And the fact that Jimmy Baker could quote it directly, and I think all of us could quote it directly, is a reflection of the tone George Bush tried to set with us, but it all derived from his mother telling him that nobody likes a braggadocio. The second thing I'd like to comment on is Lori's comment on the schedule. One of the great things about the president, George Herbert Walker Bush, and frankly, something that the staff, that I tried to take advantage of as a staff member, was his willingness to trust our recommendations. And if you look at those presidential schedules, you'll quite often see that I ducked into the office for a half a minute or a minute or 2 minutes. And quite often what that was is I probably had a cabinet member in my office or a couple of cabinet members with a disagreement. And rather than send them back to their respective offices where they would get 20 people to write a 40-page argument why each one of them was right and the other was wrong, I was able to go down to the president's office and say, we've got to make a decision between these two requests. Where do you want to go? And 90% of the time, he'd give me an answer. I take it back, and I can't tell you how many countless hours of bureaucracy were saved by a president who was willing to let the staff come in, ask a question, and leave with an answer. That doesn't sound like a big deal, but it really is a big deal. And it's part of the cement that kept the team moving and going forward as quickly as it could.
I'm suddenly realizing why somebody with a doctorate in mechanical engineering could be a good chief of staff. Philip, you look like you were going to jump in there.
Yeah. So we all keep talking about Bush doesn't boast. He's so mild. Everybody gets along, and the image you'll get coming out of this is like, oh, he seems like this very nice, mild-mannered fellow, and gee, maybe we ought to have more of these nice, sweet-tempered, mild-mannered presidents. I just want to stress, George Bush had all those traits we discussed, and which John Sununu underscored about no boasting. He is also was a fiercely competitive person. He was a very restless person by nature. Could constantly like to be in motion. He's restless, highly competitive, also in many ways quite emotional. So actually, it's an act of self-discipline on his part how much he can mask that emotion sometimes, because it actually he works to mask it because he feels emotions very strongly sometimes. This comes out, by the way, on issues like Germany, also on issues like Iraq and the Gulf War. Is if you think that you're dealing with then this relatively weak, mild-mannered person, you can discover at those moments that actually you can find a person there with enormous determination to achieve his goal.
Mm-hmm. We've just got a couple minutes left, so I'm just curious to hear if any of you all have closing thoughts for our audience who have seen this film. Is there a part that you want them to remember a little more than the rest? I have so many different memories of this film, having seen it, you know, in its formation probably a dozen times in one stage or another. I've got my own favorite memory, but I'm curious to hear what yours is.
Bill,
I'm sorry?
I'd like to hear yours. I'd like to hear your takeaway.
Mine is, it is a funny thing because, Lori, how long did it take you to make this film? Probably all told 2 years. It was something that was in one of the earliest trailers for the film, where she juxtaposes President Bush's speech before a joint session of Congress after the Iraq War. And she has him saying, remember the scene where the Iraqi soldiers are coming out of their bunkers and an American soldier says, we're good people, it's going to be okay. And he says, we're a good people, we're a caring people. That for me is the great moment in the film. And she had it 2 years ago. And all of the interviewing that she did essentially reinforces the punchline that comes at the end of, toward the end of the film.
That's a great moment for you to call up, Bill. It's very timely because we're going through a period in our history right now where we're rethinking again what we stand for in the world and whether we can stand for anything, because we're going through a period where we're very critical of ourselves and critical of whether or not we've been a force for good at all. And the question for a lot of Americans is, should we even try to be a force for good in the world? Do they care? Do we even care about them? And this was a period of time that Lori dramatizes in which the United States was a force for good in the world. In the beginning of the 1990s, the United States helped set the world on a fundamentally better path for a long time. And it wasn't perfect, it made mistakes, but that fundamental emotional tone that stuck in your mind, Bill, is one that I hope some of the audience will reflect on too as we go into this new decade.
Governor Sununu, and then we'll let Lori have the last word on her film.
Well, I think it's important to understand that good people can get good results. I'm concerned about a sense of frustration that's reflected in some of the things that Phil has just mentioned. And so I think this was a period of time where we demonstrated that good people, smart people, team-working people, good leadership, all can have good results. And at the risk of sounding self-serving, let me suggest to you there's more of this in a great book that I wrote called The Quiet Man, The Indispensable Presidency of George H.W. Bush. But I sincerely mean to tell you that I tried in there to capture some of the things that we have talked about here. And if you want a second dose, a lot of it is there. But that was a period of time that I think puts an exclamation point on the fact that the United States wants to be and can be a creator of good, a producer of good, not only for the country, but for the world.
Lori, you get the last word.
Well, you know, speaking to members of President Bush's team just gave me hope. I remember Secretary Baker saying, you know, we can do this again. We can do this. Good government matters, and we can make this happen again. And I remember Robert Blackwell saying that character matters. You know, when you go into the voting booth, don't think necessarily about specific policies, but look at the character of the person and judge that. And I just thought those were really hopeful and helpful ideas, and that are really especially important now. And so I just would encourage everyone to get out there and vote. That's what I want to close with.
Well, to the three of you, thank you all so much. To the Virginia Film Festival, our great partner who we love doing this with every year, usually a couple times. To VPM, who supported this film, to the George and Judy Marcus Praxis Fund, which has supported our own work on this, and to all of you for joining us for this, this film and this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, enjoyed it.